Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us in person here at ASPI or online. My name's Danielle Cave and I'm the Deputy Director of ASPI's International Cyber Policy Centre. The centre now totals around 30 people working across cyber, critical and emerging and strategic technologies, foreign interference and disinformation issues, and a couple other topics that we sort of touch on as well. Before we begin this evening's proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we're currently sitting, the Ngunnawal peoples. It's upon their ancestral lands that ASPI is built. And as we share our knowledge with each other today, may we also pay respects to the long history of knowledge sharing and the enduring traditions of the Ngunnawal peoples. Thank you very much for joining us for the relaunch of our project mapping China's tech giants, and a few former ASPI staff just walked in, and I think a couple of them even had to work on this project many years ago, and it's lovely to have them here. Our China Tech Map project, as we call it, is a multi-year project that tracks the global expansion of now 27 key Chinese technology companies around the world. And we think this data-heavy project continues to fill a really important research and policy gap by building understanding about the global trajectory and impact of China's largest companies working across the internet, telecommunications, artificial intelligence, surveillance, e-commerce, finance, biotechnology, big data, cloud computing, smart city and social media sectors. I'm joined on the panel today by three of my colleagues. So to my first on the left here, Dr. Samantha Hoffman, who is a senior analyst with us at ASPI, who focuses on Chinese state security and political issues, including the domestic and global implications of China's tech-enhanced authoritarianism. And within her patch, alongside looking at Chinese tech companies, Sam does a lot of work on China's social management policies, the social credit system and smart cities and so forth. To Sam's left, we have Fergus also a senior analyst with us, and Fergus has been with us for 4 long years now, at about the same time as I have. So we were back at the beginning when there was only 2 or 3 of us, and he joined us from Beijing, where he'd been working there for about a decade. He focuses on topics including Chinese social media, the Great Firewall, censorship and surveillance, and Chinese technology issues. And then to his left, stepping in for our colleague Jocelyn Kang, who was supposed to be here. She's our technical specialist with us in the centre, but is sadly sick this week. But it's fantastic that Daria Impiombato, who joined us as a China-focused researcher just last year, was able to join. And we've thrown Daria into so many different projects. I was going through them today. You're working on a lot of our Xinjiang projects, to research projects looking at TikTok, WeChat, critical technologies and so forth. We're going to be talking about our revamped China Tech Map project today, and really using this relaunch as a vehicle to talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic, growing China-US strategic and technological competition, the PRC's evolving data ecosystem, an unprecedented onslaught of sanctions from abroad, new supply chain issues, and a really quite feisty regulatory storm at home is impacting the global ambitions of China's tech giants. The project first launched in 2019, and I came up with the idea back in 2018, and it's a very, very, very simple idea, I think. And it's because our small team back then had research and policy questions, we wanted answers, and we were starting to get a lot of media requests from around the world on what Chinese company X, which back then was largely Huawei and a little bit on Tencent, was doing in XYZ country in Africa or Southeast Asia. And we found very quickly that it was actually really difficult to answer these questions. When we had time, we tried to help journalists and dig into specific projects, but we just didn't have the time week to week to do the deep dives required in both English and Chinese language to really understand, for example, what an 8 or 10 year long smart city and surveillance infrastructure project in Southeast Asia funded by a $100 million China Exxon Bank loan really looked like. And of course, what was said in Chinese language, often in government documents and in Chinese state media, was not always the same as how the projects were described and written about in English. So we came up with this project proposal to build a sort of website underpinned by a series of databases and research projects, and it really is a huge project. And I went around and bothered a couple of strengths The idea itself was really well received, but when I asked about funding, did that department or agency have any funding vehicles we could look into, open bids or tenders we could apply for, etc., I got a lot of really concerned faces back then. It turned out that everyone I spoke to was really supportive and wanted the project to exist, thought it would be incredibly useful, but no one wanted to fund it. And many officials were very open about they didn't want to be seen to be funding a project that might possibly upset the Chinese government. And I can tell you that as far as sensitive topics go, this project is nowhere near the cutting edge, I think, of sensitive topics that we and many other research institutes and universities work on. But that was a very entrenched view back in 2018. And things are starting to change, but I'll note it still remains really difficult to fund research like this. Because I couldn't attract funding for the project from within the Australian government system, I just put it on ice. I knew that I wasn't going to attract the funding from the private sector. And then about 6 months later, we had a US Army college fellow seconded to ASPI for a year, Derek, who suggested we pitch the project to the State Department. We went and spoke to the US Embassy, pitched them this project. It went into a funding round, and a couple of months later, we were successful in a funding round. And we're really grateful for that ongoing support for the State Department for this project, because it is not cheap to build really data-heavy projects like this that involve multiple staff. And we really wanted this project, not just to be a little policy paper, but to be really data rich, accessible to everyone. We wanted this to be useful for policymakers from around the world, for media, for researchers, for the business community. We want it to be really well visualised to make sure everyone could download all of the data sets that we built and that we'd spent many years now building. And I think with this relaunch, we've really achieved that. So it's a real credit to the team and the many others who've worked on that over the last year. How I'll run today is that I'm going to have a few questions that I'll ask Sam, Fergus and Daria on the project and the various topics and policy issues that this sort of work raises. I won't spend too long asking them questions, because what I've figured out with this hybrid in-person online model is you actually really get smashed from questions, particularly online. So I'll ask a couple, we'll then go to the audience, and I'll then try to go back and forth, and I have an iPad feeding me online questions here. If you're online, there'll be a chat box where you can leave questions. Those questions can be upvoted, and we do prioritise the upvoted questions. If we have 100 or 200 or 300 people online, you often get questions right at the top, and we will try to ask those questions. So please do upvote each other's questions. Samantha, I'm going to start with you. You are sort of project manager here for this behemoth of a project. It's not an easy project, the China Tech Map, as we've learned over many years of going through many iterations of it. And I think we ended up having a 6 or 7 person team working on this full or part-time for the bulk of the last 8 or 12 months. Could you run us through the major updates we've done here that we've made to this project, and where you think this relaunch this month has added the most value?
Sure. So this is, as Danielle said, this is our third major relaunch, or third iteration of this project. And with this relaunch,
as well as a privacy policy section describing the privacy policies we could find for the company's overseas activities. Most of the time that was US and North America or European privacy policies. And we've collated all of those into thematic snapshot documents that you can use now to look at company activities in Xinjiang, privacy policies, COVID-19, and party state activities as well. So we hope that will be a really useful tool, not only for researchers and decision makers, but also for journalists looking for information on these companies' activities. Additionally, we've also added 2 new reports. What we as a team early in this relaunch phase decided was that our previous reports didn't necessarily we didn't look at the data and analyze the data ourselves enough. So we wanted to change that this time and sort of explain more why you should care about the global expansion of the companies from our view. So I co-authored a paper with analyst Nathan Attrell it's titled Supply Chains in the Global Data Ecosystem. And we started out with the fact that the 27 companies we map collect massive amounts of data globally. And that has implications because of what we describe as an ecosystem of laws and regulations and approach to data security and setting of tech standards in the PRC that differ from what you would see in Australia or any other liberal democracy. And we explained why that affected digital security in the supply chain in particular. The second paper, which I won't spend too much time describing because Fergus Ryan was the lead author on that, along with Daria and Audrey Fritz in DC. And that focused on the implications of domestic regulatory environment, COVID-19, and increasing international pushback against technology companies globally. So it's a massive project. And in addition to all of that, we've added about 2,000 new data points, or 2,400 new data points, almost totaling 4,000 points of presence overseas globally for the 27 companies. So it's a massive project. If you haven't looked at the website already, I encourage you to have a look. I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, if you Google China Tech Map, it does come up first, which is convenient because that's how we sort of think of it now. Fergus, I've got a sort of two-headed question for you, so I'm sorry about that. So like for most big tech companies, I assume that China's tech giants have seen increased demand for their products during COVID, just as all global tech companies have as the world has shifted to work from home and more flexible working hours under the pandemic. But they're also operating amidst this sort of quite unique rising US-China strategic and technological tensions and competition. And then what most tech companies are not dealing with is are being put on America's entity list. And then, of course, there are these various sort of political and regulation issues at home, which are quite hard to get a handle of. Can you sort of talk us through what 2021 has been like if you're a Chinese tech giant, and what challenges and opportunities are they facing at the moment?
Sure, yeah. So 2020 and 2021 have proved to be a really tumultuous period for these Chinese tech companies. As Danielle just outlined, they were pretty much all buoyed by COVID-19 conditions as everyone around the world and in China worked from home, and those lockdown conditions really drove a lot of activity towards digital services. And so they were massive beneficiaries of that. But at the same time, there was this onslaught of sanctions from the United States. And we really saw how the United States and China, these two big superpowers, were really clashing when it comes to this massive technological fight between the two countries. And then on top of that, towards the end of 2020, many of the companies that we feature on our map found themselves engulfed in a regulatory storm at home. And our paper, which is titled Reining in China's Technology Giants, looks at this confluence of events and tries to explain how they all overlapped with each other. I guess if there's one sort of main takeout from our paper, it's that COVID-19 and this tech competition between the United States and China really exposed what leaders from Xi Jinping down in the Chinese system refer to as technological choke points for China, and made it very clear to the Chinese leadership that there were certain areas when it comes to technology that the country really needs to get on top of if they're to be self-sufficient and lead the world in advanced technologies. So the title of the paper is Reining in China's Tech Giants, and we saw that, it was not just the Trump administration and the United States who were trying to rein in these tech giants as they're expanding around the world and try to sort of slow the progress that they're making. But also, sort of counterintuitively, it's the Chinese government itself who are trying to rein in these tech giants and ensure that they more closely adhere to the industrial policy that Beijing has set forward and adhere to the strategic goals of the CCP. And in recent months, we've seen how the tech executives at these companies have sort of reacted to this new reality as this tech crackdown continues apace in Beijing. Just yesterday, we had Zheng Yiming, the CEO of ByteDance, which is the company that owns and operates TikTok, announced that he was donating. Now, let me get this figure because I need to. Yes, US $77 million. He announced yesterday that he's donating to his alma mater in his hometown in Fujian province. And this comes just 1 month after he actually stepped down as CEO. And one wonders, perhaps he has done that because of this intense pressure that is being brought to bear on Chinese tech companies. And he's certainly not alone. Many of these tech executives really feel like they're in the firing line. So overall, buoyed by the COVID-19 pandemic, it's made them feel very rich. But at the same time, many of these tech executives are feeling a little afraid at the moment.
Daria, let's go to you and then we might come back this way. You spent the sort of last 6 to 12 months looking to a range of companies that we have as a part of the project. And I want to zero in on one that was a new addition this year, Ant Group, an affiliate of Alibaba, which owns China's largest online payment platform, Alipay, which I think has around 1 billion users around the world. Why did you guys decide to add Ant Group and expand into the digital payment space? And what does Ant's global profile look like?
Well, originally I was looking at Alibaba. And then soon I realized it was probably worth having just a deeper dive into Ant Group and Alipay, because since the app span off, its business is mainly focused on Chinese users. So up until very recently, only Chinese bank accounts were allowed on the app. But then this changed, and now actually foreign accounts are also using the app. So because of the type of data that Alipay collects, we thought it would be really interesting, especially since our more recent focus on data collection and data privacy policies. And, Alipay collects any sort of data from spending habits to payment patterns and all that. So the company has also increased its presence overseas. I think we counted about 130 points of presence so far. And that goes from investments in other e-wallet apps overseas or commercial partnerships with other fintech companies. And that's quite interesting to see how it went from a business that was mainly focused locally, with 95% of its profits, I think, were made in China, to a business that is more outlooking. And it was also really interesting that we started looking at that at the same time as the Chinese Communist Party actually hit it pretty hard with the regulatory crackdown that Fergus was talking about. In fact, Ant was probably the worst off out of all the tech giants. It was fined very heavily by the regulatory bodies, and it was also put under direct supervision of China's central bank. So it's pretty clear that the CCP was not happy with how much power and the monopoly that this company had accumulated, and it decided to fully scrap its plans to go public in Shanghai and Hong Kong, and it just cancelled its initial IPO that was meant to be the biggest in the world. It just never happened. So there were many reasons to track it. We also ended up finding a lot of interesting information about party activities, which were very similar to all the other companies we looked at, but also at the stakeholders that were definitely very close to the CCP.
Sam, I'm actually going to come back to you. I thought I'd do this neat movement thing, but it won't work out that way. I want to ask you about what's happening in the US at the moment, and it helps that you're American. The Biden administration is announcing a sort of raft of new China-focused policies and strategies and a couple of executive orders that you stay sort of quite closely sort of in touch with. And especially these EOs, the executive orders, are especially coming out in the technology supply chain entity list space. It includes new lists of Chinese military companies. We recently saw President Biden revoke a Trump executive order that sought to ban Chinese-owned apps, WeChat and TikTok, and replace that EO with a new EO, mandating a broad review of apps controlled by foreign adversaries. And this EO authorises the US Commerce Department to kick that review off immediately. How do you sort of see all of these policies and strategies and new EOs sort of coming together in the US? And is it forming a new or different approach that the US is taking on sort of China and national security and technology issues?
My personal opinion is that, generally speaking, with specific to China tech policy, there hasn't been a huge shift under the Biden administration from the policies that we saw developing under the former Trump administration. Of course, what has changed, I think, is the tone. And also, I think that a lot of what we're seeing is specific to the executive orders. I think it's to ensure the enforceability of the orders as well. So I think that there's a bit of a reset in that sense, but not in terms of the general policy direction. I think, though, that with the Biden administration, there's a greater focus on how to collaborate with international partners. And one thing, though, I want to highlight is that with the particular to the Department of Defense order, I think that the change in language, and this is actually something that analyst in the U.S., Emily Weinstein, pointed out in a thought out Twitter thread, and then I think later in a Lawfare blog, that the change in focus from military civil fusion strategy, this PRC's NCF strategy, versus to U.S. military defense industrial complex is a change that concerns me a bit, because I think we need to, when we're focusing on China and tech issues in particular, we need to focus on what the Chinese Communist Party is saying its objectives are and how it envisions its use of technology. And that's what we highlight in the supply chain report. Because if you think about a lot of the issues we're highlighting, especially in the supply chain report related to data collection and transfer, what we're describing isn't necessarily unique behavior. What's different are, in fact, the ways that the CCP approaches state security and social management and controlling companies through its numerous state security legislation, the new data security law, the personal information protection law, all set a different tone in terms of what those concepts are actually defined as in the PRC versus anywhere else. And so I think it's important that as we see some of these changes, that definition or the party's vision isn't lost. Not for the simple reason that otherwise policy will end up being a little bit too broad and vague, or that we won't resolve what I see as a problem in general, not just specific to the US, globally, where we tend to take a whack-a-mole approach to companies like Huawei or TikTok, instead of looking at and defining the underlying problems. Because without doing that, then in the long run, we're still going to be confronting the same problems down the line, because we aren't, if you don't define, say, the way that the party uses data collected from not only just sensitive military related topics, but also, sentiment data, how that contributes to propaganda or relationship mapping and things like that, then you're missing its vision for how that might be applied in a security context. And so I think that all of that will be important in order to develop the long-term policies that are going to then make the United States as well as allies more competitive with China in the tech space.
So it's a sort of continuation, but the key difference being the multilateral aspect, working with partners and allies.
Yeah. And then the big risk is that, as we move forward, and I don't think that this is unique to the Biden administration or the US, it's that I think it's important to make sure that that the China-specific context isn't lost as we look to, with the TikTok order. It's now looking an executive order that's going to be a broad review of apps controlled by foreign adversaries. So it's important to make sure that we distinguish between, what the risks that China poses are versus other countries. And the other thing that I think I see happening, and it's a positive thing under the Biden administration, is more, I think, I sense there'll be more cooperation across areas like data security policy and privacy frameworks, and issues like developing more risk-based approaches to data transfers and topics like that. So I see that hopefully improving over the next 4 years.
To be potentially more strategic planning than the last administration. Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll open it up to the audience and we'll jump back and forth with online and in-person questions, and I'll come in if things get a bit quiet. This is open to all of you. And I think so many of us struggle to really get on top of this issue. How are you seeing the all-important relationship between China's tech giants or Chinese industry more broadly and the CCP developing at the moment? Where are things at now, and does anyone want to guesstimate where things could be going in the coming years? It's a hard question.
Yeah, I'll start us off. It's interesting to see how the market in China really understands what the relationship between these tech companies and the CCP is. You only need to look at this recent anecdote of, I think it was the CEO of Meituan, which is an e-commerce tech company, not featured on our map, but nonetheless, their share price plunged 10% on one day, simply because the CEO had posted a Tang Dynasty poem. And many people thought that embedded in this poem was a sort of inherent criticism of Xi Jinping. And that was enough to completely freak out the market. And as I was saying earlier this evening, we've seen a string of resignations of senior executives at major Chinese tech companies because they're afraid that this regulatory crackdown is not just about sort of legitimate reasons, antitrust concerns about these companies. They are massive, and there are concerns that they're stifling competition. There are data privacy concerns that are outlined in Sam's paper and the like. But overlaid over this is the political dimension. And it's very clear to these Chinese tech companies and their executives that they really need to, stop working on things that they may think are of commercial value, but are not adhering enough to China's industrial policy or the goals of the CCP. So one of the sort of perennial things with this project is evidence of what they call party building inside these tech companies. And that's something that we outlined in the very first iteration of this project. And it's something that has continued all the way through. There are essentially party cells inside all of these companies. But there's a lot of debate as to how much sway they hold over the direction of these companies. I think what has changed now is that these regulatory actions are being used to exert more discipline over these companies. So not only is there this internal, vector of control via the party committees inside the companies, but there's also this legal apparatus and regulatory push that are putting even more pressure on these Chinese tech companies to make sure that they are heading down the path that the Chinese Communist Party wants. And that's a path towards technological self-sufficiency.
So adding to what Fergus has said, I wanted to go back to a point that I made earlier and one that's in the paper. We talk about the data collection capabilities of the 27 companies in the tech map. And something that's often misunderstood in at least the public debate on this issue is that it's often assumed, are you suggesting that then all of the data these companies collect is automatically accessible by the state? Well, that's not what we're saying. But what we do argue in this paper, and I think what I've seen evidence of in my other research is it's not only just through the laws like the state security legislation and the new data security law and the pending personal information protection law that the party sets expectations for responsibility in terms to the state in terms of data access that the party can have. But it's also through standard setting. And what we describe in the paper, and I think what others have also described earlier this year, I think it was IPVM who put out a report describing some of the standards, is that in the PRC, technical committees that consist of both the private companies, so-called private companies, and also in certain instances, it would be the public security research institutes or defense research institutes are involved in setting standards for things like facial recognition systems. And in order to win bids for a project domestically, companies are expected to meet those standards. That's an evolving system in the PRC. Now, China prioritizes participating in global standard setting across a number of issues. Digital currency is one. We've just posted a new, along with the project we had last year, did a paper on China's digital currency, electronic payment, along with the launch of TechMap. One of the co-authors, Matthew Johnson, has posted a blog on the strategist, ASPI strategist, describing that. And that's just one area where the PRC seeks to help set global standards. Now, if those standards are baked into the technology that are set at the domestic level with the involvement of public security and the PLA and other party state entities, those same standards are likely the ones that are being exported globally as these technologies enter the global marketplace. So that's a another risk where the party's just creating a more ease of access. So it's not that all of the data these companies collect would potentially go to the party state, but it's creating a framework or an ecosystem, how we describe it in our paper, where through the laws, through the standard setting, it's able to better follow through with its demands. To reiterate also what Fergus described, the state security laws all require companies to participate in handing over data. And I think that there's been some misconception in some of the public debate where it's argued that companies push back. And while they might say that they push back, and maybe sometimes they do, it's important to remember, and especially all you have to do is look at the case of Alibaba and Jack Ma to realize that the state ultimately has power, and when it says that when it makes a demand, ultimately that can't be changed, no matter who's pushing back, and also the idea that a company like Huawei or whether it's TikTok, Alibaba, if they say, well, we are not going to hand over data, or we are going to push back, they're required to say that by law as well. And that's the Intelligence Law, Article 7, which says you have to keep secret any participation in this work. And the Data Security Law reinforces the relevance to data collection that the Intelligence Law has, as well as the Personal Information Protection Law. All of them say that there are national security instances where they can make these demands, and the Personal Information Protection Law protects personal information except for when the party state's power is concerned.
All right, did you want to jump in, Daria? No, I'm going to open. I've got quite a few questions coming in via the iPad, but let's open it to the floor first in case anyone has a question or idea that they'd like to throw out there. And I will start picking on former ASPI staff members. Yeah, in the middle here.
My name's Ashley. I've got a question for Daria.
Sorry, Ashley, we'll just wait for them. Thanks.
Hopefully you can hear me a bit better now. So you mentioned that Ant Group is clearly seeking more like outward traction in its profits. And I was wondering if you think that that's because China is seeking to do that standard setting internationally, so it's more of that party angle, or whether you think it's more to do with Ant Group hedging its bets and making sure that it is actually getting profits elsewhere that aren't necessarily restricted by local regulation.
I think it's potentially both, but the second is way more likely. I think especially with China trying to centralize as much as possible online payments. I think both Ant Group with Alipay and Tencent with WeChat Pay are worried about losing, basically just losing business within China and losing revenue. And so expanding their market overseas is potentially a way to stay afloat. And definitely they would be less regulated than, or there would be less scrutiny overseas than the scrutiny they're under right now in China.
All right, I'm going to go, unless anyone has a burning question, I'll hit the iPad. We've got lots of questions coming in here. Alex has asked, with these Chinese tech giants, is the self-censorship wanting to be seen as more loyal to the party, or the Chinese state wanting to be more intrusive? Who wants to grab that one? I feel like Fergus, you can.
Not sure I quite follow the logic of that question. Could you say it again?
Is the self-censorship wanting to be seen as more loyal to the party, or is it the Chinese state being more intrusive, or both? I'm happy for you to reshape the question as you like.
It's probably a bit of both, if I understand the question correctly.
Yeah.
I think the party isn't necessarily being more intrusive than it has been in theory in the past, but I think what's happening with the a suite of state security legislation we've seen pass under Xi Jinping is that the party is reminding all companies and individuals that they are in fact responsible to state security, and following through with it in ways that make the companies react. And I think if companies want to stay in business and they want to have to operate to operate in China, then they have to comply with those demands.
What are your children's very good question here? How do the Chinese government's regulations and crackdown on technology affect innovation and entrepreneurship in China?
Well, I mean, to start with, this crackdown is only really just beginning. As Daria outlined, It really began with Ant Group, and the founder of that company, Jack Ma, who I'm sure everyone is aware of, gave quite a scathing speech in Shanghai. I think it was in September 2020. That in that speech, he was making the point that tech companies like his own, and more specifically Ant Group, a fintech company, he was sort of making the argument that we are so new and so innovative that that the old regulations shouldn't apply to us. Now, he had a huge amount of chutzpah saying this, because in the room were senior regulators who were extremely annoyed that he had said this, and it went all the way to Xi Jinping. And there's very credible reporting from the Wall Street Journal that Xi Jinping himself was incensed and personally decided that the IPO of Ant Group would not go ahead. And as Daria said earlier, it was going to happen in 2 days' time, and it was going to be the world's largest initial public offering, completely scrapped like that. Now, since that has happened, that was sort of a watershed moment where the regulatory bodies in China realized that a lot of the plans that they had been slowly developing, they now had a green light to actually enact them. And so we're seeing this campaign really picking up a head of steam, and many different companies are being targeted now. So, as I said earlier, there are many legitimate reasons for a crackdown of this nature to take place. Chief among them is that these companies are massive, and they really do stifle competition. So a lot of the complaints that Facebook and Google get in America and Europe and elsewhere about their, the oversized nature of these companies and how they do manage to, stifle competition and buy up smaller players, that really is a problem in China as well. So it's my expectation that this regulatory action will have a positive effect for innovation in China, and it will free up some space for some of the sort of smaller startups to also gain some market share.
I might turn, did you want to jump in there or no? I might turn to, there's a couple of questions about supply chains. I'm going to try to stitch those together. One is about Australia and one is more global. We'll start global from Kai. In your view, should international supply chain laws focus on a potentially problematic entanglement within the Chinese economy or about global capitalism at large? And on the back of that, there's a second question about how can Australian government procurement bodies, both state and Commonwealth, be better informed about this project and hopefully reform their digital supply chains? Do you want to sort of give those a shot?
Yeah.
Maybe just put the microphone up a little bit.
On the first question, if I understand correctly, I think that it's, in particular, liberal democracies should be looking at any country who is a potential adversary and questioning what exposure they have in their supply chain to those countries. And China is obviously the major actor that I think many countries should be concerned about. And COVID-19 just highlighted that. But I think what we try to do in our report, and I think the second question gets to, is think a little bit more broadly about what supply chain risk is. Because with digital supply chain risk, oftentimes the conversation is focused on a malicious actor that breaks into the system, and or it's focused on issues like the say semiconductor supply chain. And what we're describing in our report is something that's slightly different in terms of the way that very normal business relationships and very normal activities, and things that do not seem like a threat can become a threat. And that's because, and I think the starting point of this report was a report that I did in 2019 called Engineering Global Consent. And it was about a propaganda department linked company called Global Tone Communications Technology. And this company is engaged in machine translation and collects data globally and uses that data not only to provide the translation services that they say they provide, but also to contribute, in their own words, to state security, to things like facial recognition and voice recognition capabilities. And so in that sense, they're using the data in multiple ways. It's not a dual-use technology that is used in one way or the other. It's always kind of both. And we described that in this report also, that Chinese tech companies tend to occupy all layers. We describe it through the technology stack example. So we show how US companies also occupy those layers, but then describe the difference as being the way that the party state exerts power over these companies in the ways that we've described already in this panel. Through the law and standard setting and so on. So we see that as a risk that's being overlooked and one that's quite important. So I think that one thing that needs to happen in future research is I think that we need to better define ways of doing due diligence when it comes to dealing with companies like those that we map in the tech map project. And I think what researchers can do is describe, I mean, it's quite a big task, but I think we need to do something to better describe the way that these companies enter the supply chain visually, because I think the biggest problem is that the individuals companies making decisions about engagements with these technology companies aren't going to have the time to do the research or necessarily the language capabilities to do the research that's needed to identify those risks. So something needs to be built in response to that.
Any more questions from the audience? Yeah, there's just a question at the front here, Matthew.
Great presentation, guys. Jeff Brown. Listening to the comments around the legislation and I guess what the CCP is doing to a lot of these tech organisations. I know I'm looking at this from a private sector perspective, but it seems to me that there's a huge risk that the intellectual capability of the country will look to that area of least resistance in terms of investing, growing and developing their IP. Let's use it that way. So wouldn't the CCP be saying, hang on, we're going to lose a lot of young entrepreneurs, startups to Silicon Valley or similar, where they can play much more freely in a global market than what they can do there? So aren't they undermining a lot of the opportunities that they're trying to create? And with that obviously comes a technology that can then, I won't say weaponise, but can use in the development of the organisation to take the Chinese on head-to-head commercially?
I tend to think that a lot of the young, tech whizzes at these companies might welcome what the Chinese government is doing when it comes to these tech companies and their efforts to try and compel them to work towards the strategic aims of the Chinese Communist Party, and that's because the goal of the CCP is for these companies to make real fundamental scientific breakthroughs. And so the kind of research that they want them to do is very basic fundamental research that will hopefully enable them to leapfrog the competition. There was a famous in China, People's Daily editorial in December 2020, I believe it was. And the point that article was making was these tech companies, particularly the online platforms, the Tencents, the Alibabas, they're spending too much effort on things like group buying, and you know, they're putting their brain power into innovating business models, really, rather than actually making true scientific advances. And as I've said a number of times tonight, what COVID did in combination with the US-China trade war and the technological stoush between the US and China is help the Chinese leadership realize and recognize these choke points. You know, the best example, of course, of that are semiconductors, and China. You know, they're very much the building blocks for the advanced technology that China hopes to lead the world in. But China doesn't have an indigenous capability to produce the best semiconductors to be able to, you know, for their companies to really succeed and advance. The supply chain for semiconductors is incredibly complicated, and it's spread out over a number of jurisdictions, including Taiwan, notably. So China and the Chinese leadership, they want these tech companies not to focus on things like group buying and you know, innovations in social media posting, but actual fundamental scientific breakthroughs. And I wouldn't be surprised if young tech workers would think that that would be a good goal.
Any other questions from the audience? All right, I've got 2 or 3 more here that we'll try to power through, and then in 5 minutes I will let you go to drink drinks and eat canapes. A question here is saying, are we saying that democratic countries need to put a renewed focus on standards organisations? So this person, I think Alex, has mentioned ITU, ISO, IEEE, which I don't know about that one. In addition to that, there's another question here that maybe Fergus, you're best placed to answer, although if I'm wrong, Daria or Sam, please jump in. What effects of Xi Jinping's dual circulation proposal is going to have or is already having on the domestic tech economy? Any moves away from buying imported tech or actual moves to boost domestic supply chain independence?
Okay, I'll just quickly start with that second one. Dual circulation. One of the fun things about China watching is that every few weeks or so, the CCP come out with a new concept that everyone sort of scratches their heads about trying to figure out what does this really mean. We take a stab at it in our paper. Basically, my understanding of it is that because of the reasons that I've outlined tonight, and COVID, and the risks that the Chinese leadership have seen in supply chains, combined with the US-China trade war, that prompted very fundamental rethinking when it comes to economics with the Chinese leadership. And at a series of senior Politburo meetings, this idea emerged throughout 2020 of dual circulation. And what it means is that China is going to rely a bit more on the domestic drivers of the economy, and also try to figure out ways to wean themselves off technology and supply chains from the outside world. It's both a defensive and an offensive maneuver. This sort of realignment of the economy is hoped by the Chinese leadership to make them less susceptible to the sanctions that they've been feeling the brunt of, but also give them give the country an extra capability to be able to push back and to, frankly, to use economic coercion on companies and countries. So what we've been seeing that's been happening to H&M and to, as an example of a company, and Australia as an example of a country, this economic coercion is only going to be heightened by dual circulation. So simply attempting to understand that is enough for me. I'm not sure I can quite go the next step to think about how that will affect the Chinese tech companies, but perhaps that's for a future paper.
The first question was on participating in tech standards bodies. Absolutely. I think that's needed. The one thing I would caution, though, is that it's important to remember that oftentimes, especially the way that China describes certain concepts in these international forums is that we tend to use the same language but have completely different definitions for what those things mean. If you're talking about cyber sovereignty, and national security, all of those issues have concepts have different meanings that the PRC very clearly defines in its own writings and policy documents. So it's easy enough for us to go in and look at those, but I think it's important to pay attention to those and the way that they affect what China is saying in those bodies, and then make sure that the alternative vision that's offered addresses that effectively. Otherwise, we're going to have the same problem. You can't just rely on more participation, because it's not as if liberal democracies are completely absent from those bodies. I think the issue is that oftentimes we are failing to recognize the core problem.
Right, Daria, we have time for one more question. I want you to talk about Europe's evolving relationships with China and some of these companies, and how governments over in Europe, and you're from Italy, so please give us a bit of a minute or two on Italy, are dealing with these companies, whether it be on 5G, digital payments, smart cities, surveillance. What do they do about high-risk vendors, etc.?
What is Europe doing? I don't know. I always get very mad looking what Italy does in this space, because they've been a bit all over the place, and with all the different governments we've had in a very short amount of time, we tend to change our position a lot. But arguably, Italy was probably the most important country to join the Belt and Road Initiative. So the relationships between the Italian government and the Chinese one have been good. And up until 2019, there was a huge expansion of 5G rollouts in Europe with Huawei and ZTE involved. And the Chinese state media went as far as saying that Italy rolled out the welcome mat to Huawei. But things have been changing, and I think maybe that wave of sort of populist governments really helped China during that time. But now we're seeing how a lot of countries are pushing back on high risk vendors like Huawei and ZTE, like we've seen in the UK, Portugal, Spain, the Czech Republic. There's really a lot, not only countries, but also the companies, like the local telcos, just sort of leaving out potential high-risk vendors. What 5G has been scrutinized the most, I think, but I think they're still very European governments in particular are pretty lax on scrutinizing surveillance companies and AI companies like Hikvision and Dahua. And only now, I think there have been a few investigations finding out that there are Hikvision security systems installed not only across airports and universities in Europe, but also government buildings. Like we have in Italy, in Rome, one of the main buildings where the Prime Minister resides has both Hikvision and Dahua surveillance systems. And if you click on our map and you filter Europe and surveillance, there are over 160 points that come up. So to the question also whether, you know, these sanctions and the pressure from the US, whether that's working, it hasn't really worked at all yet. These companies are still selling a lot in Europe. And the scrutiny is just only started when we know that with European bureaucracy and institutions, it just takes way too long before they catch up.
Thank you. That's a perfect way to end on, and I won't take us any further outside the hour here because canapes and drinks are waiting. Do Google China Tech Map, and it will come up, and have a play around the map and get in touch if you've got feedback or questions or want to chat further. In the next week or two, we'll be putting up a bunch of events. We've got sort of policy papers coming out on ransomware, on influence for hire actors in the Indo-Pacific region, so how governments are essentially outsourcing both covert and overt influence operations to private companies, particularly across Southeast Asia. And we've got a couple more that I can't think of, but do watch our events website there. Let's end by thanking our panellists. They're a bit burnt out and they're pretty tired from the last few months. So thank you very much for joining us here today, both online and in person.